Well, welcome everyone. I'm Natalie Edmond, she, her pronouns, and I'm happy to be here with
I'm Cap. Good to meet you all. He, him pronouns.
great. So we are going to spend some time talking about navigating political stress. We all know we just went through a presidential election, and that might have stirred up some feelings for people. Um, Whether you decided to vote or not vote, or your candidate won or didn't win. And we know that the impact of the election has a variety of responses on our student population and staff and faculty. And so we want to make sure that coming from the counseling center that we are supporting your mental health and well-being. So we've created some things for you to kind of think about. And I remember when I did freshman orientation this year, I did this graphic, which is just honoring all the parts of you and the students that come to this campus. That we vary in terms of race and identity and whether we're an introvert or extrovert, how much imposter syndrome we move around in the world with, if we're neurodivergent, if we are more athletic, if we do things with ease or it takes a lot of effort to get our work done, how much we cultivate rest in our life. What's the family of origin we came from, and how does that impact who we are? And thinking about gender and sexuality, our histories of trauma, what kind of temperament we might have. And we just have different nervous systems. So I like to think of like we're carrying all of these identities and ways of being in the world inside of ourselves. And I like the visual of the bus because it makes me think about the ways in which, we get to decide, how compassionate we're going to be towards ourselves, how accepting we're going to be of all the different identities we bring into this world. And I think it really takes a lot of practice to develop that kind of loving kindness towards oneself and to other people. And who's going to drive the bus? What part of ourself is driving the bus? So I always want to invite people to think about that is who's driving the bus? Especially when I'm feeling upset, is which part of myself is going to show up? And how can we build the skills to be mindful of that, but then also to be able to be the most effective version of ourselves, whatever our roles are? So I think about how we organize our experiences on 6 different levels. There's the body. How's your body talking to you? Maybe just take a moment to do this kind of scan with me. Just notice, how's your breathing? How's your heart rate? Any aches or pains? Any tension in your shoulders? Maybe in your neck? Maybe that space in between the eyebrows? Noticing if your body is holding anything, but also noticing any places where you might have ease. And noticing any images that come and go. Noticing any feelings, whether it's super intense or nothing, or all the spaces in between. And maybe making room to hold on to or experience a number of feelings. Noticing your thoughts as they come and go and arise and fall. What stories might you be telling yourself? Maybe your mind is racing, or maybe it is pretty quiet. Maybe there's a recurring thought that it's hard to let go of. And what's the vibe? What's the energy you're getting from the space or wherever you happen to be right now? What's the vibe of your department, your classes, your home? And then I think of behaviors or movement or action urges. What do you feel like doing? How's your body moving? Are you noticing that you are sitting up straight or lying down? or feel a little bit collapsed, a little heavy. So this kind of, 2-minute meditation is something we can do before a class, before we arrive to work or class or at home, something we can do in our car. So I just think about how these 2-minute meditations or 2-minute mindfulness experiences could let you know how resourced are you right now? What's your capacity? Maybe you are full of hope and excitement. Maybe you are full of dread or terror or despair. Or maybe you are just kind of going through the motions, a little disconnected, just kind of in survival mode. And all of these variations of yourself are welcome. I think about, as someone who thinks a lot about nervous system, thinking about how do we expand our window of tolerance. And I think about the wider our window of tolerance, the more we have ventral vagal energy, like that's that part of ourselves that feels safe and social, where our frontal cortex is online, the more we can be there for other people, whether that's taking a class or teaching a class, being in a staff meeting or any kind of meeting, being with family, taking care of kids, taking care of friends, family members. And then thinking about what's our stress response. When do we go into hyperarousal, where we're mobilized into action? Maybe that's fight or flight, or fix or do, or keep busy. Or when we get so overwhelmed, we go into shutdown, into hyperarousal, into dorsal vagal, where we might be more depressive or numb or unmotivated or heavy or disconnected or shameful. And the beauty of our brains is the neuroplasticity. We can widen our window of tolerance. We can build skills. We can change our mindset to be able to handle the stressors of our world. This is just another way to kind of think about the different stress responses that can be trauma responses, right? That fight or flight, which many of us are used to hearing about. But what about freeze? You ever have those moments where you're just like doom scrolling on your phone, you're spacing out, feeling isolated, or isolating on purpose, or procrastinating? It's hard to motivate yourself to complete tasks. Maybe you're holding your breath, not quite connected. Or maybe you're fawning, right? Doing a lot of people pleasing, hard to set boundaries, hard to say no, hard to assert yourself. Maybe you're always looking for approval. Or maybe you don't even really know what your own needs are. And then I think about collapse, where my body just like wants to succumb when I think of collapse. My breathing may be shallow. I might be just like deer in headlights, or I might be despairing. Like, what's the point? I might not be really feeling in my body. And then I think about attachment, like attachment cry, where it can be our younger parts showing up, wanting reassurance, having trust issues, wailing or sobbing, feeling small or clingy. And so I think it's helpful to know which part of ourselves is showing up, and maybe it's multiple parts. And then again, who's driving that bus um, in whatever activities you're doing in your life. So when we think about um, politics or political stress, I like this graphic from More in Common, which really comes from the work of Tanya Israel, who does a lot of work around like helping to build bridges across political differences. And so I appreciate the graphic because it really says that there is such a range of political identities, and that our media might want us to believe that it's deeply polarized and people are on the extremes. And yet, the people on the extremes in terms of political ideology is actually small, that most people are kind of moderate, leaning a little to the left or a little bit to the right. And that most people are in that exhausted majority, or what I would call the movable middle, right? That exhausted majority is like so full of um, other things preoccupying their life, parenting, um, living paycheck to paycheck, just trying to take care of, the different parts of their life. and they don't really have the capacity to do a deep dive into politics. And we live in a two-party system for the most part. And so, if people are voting, they have to make a choice. And they have different values and priorities of what's important to them. And how do we hold space? How do we hold space for all of this? But how do we remember that most people are in that middle category? And that there's a range, there's a diversity within that. And I just want you to pause and check in with yourself. What does it feel like to look at this graphic and think about all the people you encounter, that they fall somewhere here, whether they're politically disengaged or liberal or conservative. And I think about what are the ways in which that might show up in your classes, right? And how do we create a space for inclusion, a place of belonging? How do we live into the Villanova values of veritas, caritas, and unitas? How do we, continue to seek truth and understanding? How do we care for each other? And how do we create community? And how do we encourage dialogue and discourse across differences? And what are the supports on campus that we might have, like ODEI, um, or health promotion, or the counseling center, um, or Office of Belonging and Inclusion, all these places where we can support dialogues. And I think that uh, faculty have to decide, like, am I going to talk about politics in class? Am I going to address it? Do I have the bandwidth for that? Do I have the capacity for that? And so I want you to think about some resourcing, right? So important to have community, to find your people, like-minded people, people who accept you as you are. Lean into joy and gratitude. Um, that sometimes when we're in our devices, we can just see the doom and gloom. And yet we can also in our devices and looking outside of our devices also see joy and gratitude. Become friends with your emotions. Our emotions are a messenger, a signal. They give you a sense of how you're reacting to the world and your thoughts. Befriend rage. I think rage gets a bad rap. And I think that rage can be mobilizing. It can be destructive if left unattended to, if left to accumulate, if not processed. But it can also mobilize people into action. Um, and how are you going to create these places of anti-oppression, right? Of belonging and inclusion for everybody. We're not canceling anyone. We're making room for everyone, even if we don't agree. And I'm also thinking about, like, how do we take care of the most vulnerable among us? So if we think about our colleagues, our students, who is vulnerable, meaning if they don't have the same protections because of laws, because of status, and how do we have that in mind? That for some people, an election is just an election. It's not that big of a deal. And for other people, it's life-changing. Encouraging you to develop hobbies, or if you've taken a break from some hobbies, to dive back in, to reconnect with that, to rest more, have some sort of daily or almost daily practice of prayer or journaling or meditation or being in nature, yoga, set limits about how much you are on technology or consuming news, embrace neurodiversity and the rhythm of your nervous system. Of course, I'm going to champion some therapy. Um, Move, discharge energy, exercise, support mutual aid, support each other, and diversify where you get your information and news from. Um, and let's try to imagine something different, right? That even if it looks like we're deeply polarized, what are the ways we can build bridges and come together? Um, and that's not going to happen by accident. It's going to happen because we intentionally lean towards each other and move towards each other.
I wanted to piggyback off of most of those points, Dr. Edmond. So I guess starting out, there was a statistic that was gathered from the American Psychological Association, and this was regardless of political party. And it stated that 76% of Americans found that the future of our nation is a significant source of stress. 66% are stressed by the current political climate. And some research indicated that even thinking about politics makes people anxious, which can precipitate into stress and sometimes sadness. So I thought it would be good to kind of look at anxiety first. So if anxiety is kind of the precipitant to sadness or stress, if we look at anxiety and think about what it is, anxiety can sometimes be a sign that we're stretching to achieve new limits. In these cases, it's an indicator that we're growing, and we need to stay the course and accept that growth is sometimes uncomfortable. Other times, anxiety is our body telling us that things may be legitimately too intense. And we can question and start doing some introspection with regards to how do we recalibrate, how do we rebalance, and sort of explore that. There's a construct of anticipatory anxiety, which is the fear or worry that arises before an anticipated event, often rooted in the expectation or potential negative or uncontrolled outcome. And it can be triggered by situations that feel challenging or uncertain. So, regardless of the origin of the anxiety, in most cases, anxiety will typically start with a worrying thought. Sometimes that's grounded in fear. We then go through kind of a negative thought loop. And as we go through this negative thought loop, those thoughts sort of spin. And our body, our nervous system, our mind start beginning to take notice. And we have these physiological symptoms that kind of arise. This can manifest into things like fear. Other times, this is our brain's attempt to convince us to try to control something that we fundamentally cannot. Sometimes we can argue that the anxiety is also like potentially an inhibitory motion. So some believe that we have these core emotions, and if we're not fully in touch with those core emotions, anxiety sometimes can show up as a means to protect us from feeling those deeper emotions, because we haven't yet developed a strong connection to those deeper emotions. And it's often thought that if we have that connection with those deeper emotions, or if we formulate that bond, we can then start to process them. If we can't fully process the deeper emotions, sort of like I said before, anxiety will step in to protect us from that deeper emotion if we're not fully ready yet. So one of the most effective ways of coping with anxiety is simply by learning to practice acceptance. So thinking to ourselves, kind of ruminating in the ideas that acceptance doesn't necessarily mean that we approve of the candidate or the outcome of the election. Instead, acceptance is sort of the acknowledgement of the reality of the differences, including the pain and fears that you hold, rather than fixating on trying to change what is causing us to feel that as though we are suffering, which can sometimes leave us feeling in a dark and difficult place. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of walk through like a CBT oriented approach of becoming aware of what it is that we're experiencing first, kind of walking through grounding us so that we're able to process what it is that we're becoming aware of, and then fully go through a processing. And so if we start with that cognitive reframe, maybe it's helpful to think about political ads. So political ads typically are based on fear, and they're driven and created so that it, causes for us to catch attention, hooking us with an emotional appeal rather than logic and sometimes accurate information. We can use this knowledge as a defense to sort of work at keeping from getting emotionally carried away by emotional arguments founded in unreliable information potentially. Further, this is also important to remember that while political views are a part of who we are, they don't necessarily define us holistically. So with that awareness, we can become aware of the sensations that are arising. Leaning into Dr. Edmond's mindfulness approach, we can kind of see where in our body, doing a body scan, where these emotions are sort of escalating. Once we're fully aware of that, or even partially aware of that, we can start working through grounding exercises. I've included on the slide 4 simple grounding techniques to keep calm. The first one is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique, which is pretty much just a check-in with our sensories. So 5 is identify 5 things that you can see. 4, identify 4 things that you can touch. 3, identify 3 things that you can hear. 2 is 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And in doing this practice, it's pulling from information of if we're looking too far in the past, sometimes that is grounds for where depression may arise if we're ruminating too much in the past. If we're looking and thinking about too many things in the future, sometimes that's grounds for where anxiety exists. But this sensory check-in sort of helps us stay in this present moment. And by doing so, hopefully both dissipate and we're grounded and we're able to stay planted. And sometimes you'll feel like those sensations will dissipate. The second tool that we can use is using weighted objects. So holding onto a small object such as a stone or a textured item, focusing in on that texture, the weight, the shape. Hopefully that will help soothe and ground ourselves in the moment. Another technique is temperature awareness or regulation of temperature. So we can use a warm mug, a coffee mug, or we can get a glass of ice and hold a piece of ice even if you wanted to notice the temperature change. That often is a gentle reminder, gentle grounding, again, to bring us back to this present moment. There's also the tense and release grounding mechanism. So if you think about a specific body part, typically I always talk to folks about using their hand. If you clench your hand for a few seconds and then slowly release, you will then be able to ground yourself as well. If movement's limited in this type of situation, you can always imagine or visualize yourself clenching your fists and then slowly releasing. That helps to get us more present focused. And once we're in that calm state of mind, we can start kind of working towards processing what is going on. And so if we look at processing, what does that typically mean? So first and foremost, it would be that awareness piece, allowing for us to kind of identify specific triggering events or triggering situations that kind of provoke the anticipatory anxiety or any anxiety for that matter. Understanding the specific situations or events that cause the anxiety, that can then help us prepare to move through them more effectively. If we're noticing kind of negative thoughts or irrational, sometimes catastrophic thoughts that are being provoked by some of these specific triggers, we can kind of work towards reframing them and replacing them with more realistic or positive thoughts in nature. And it's at that point that we can start integrating some of the relaxation techniques or anything that you feel like is working towards helping you stay in a relaxed frame of mind. That can be deep breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness meditation. And that mindfulness exercise is going to help us center ourselves so that we can move towards acceptance. So we can practice being present with the moment, accepting our thoughts and feelings non-judgmentally, and then maybe even going a step further and visualizing success. If we continuously visualize success for ourselves, navigating the event or situation that's causing for the anxiety, we can then kind of visualize ourselves being calm, confident, in control to then move towards preparation and plan, utilizing all these specific techniques to then break down the event or situation into smaller, manageable steps to create a plan to address each specific step. So in sum, whatever it is that you're feeling, whether it's happiness, anger, hopelessness, fear, any uncomfortable combination of any of these sensations, just work towards reframing and remembering we're using emotional reasoning at that moment. So if we lean into some of the grounding techniques that we discussed, some of these processing tools, we can re-regulate kind of our oxygen carbon dioxide ratios as well through deep breathing. Lean in through to a favorite tactic, one that speaks to you, and then start working towards practicing positives, replacing any of the negative, irrational, maybe catastrophic thoughts with things that are more uplifting to strengthen these positive neuronal connections that we have. If we can move to the next slide, we can start talking towards a reduction plan. So there are a number of stress reduction plans, but we have to find one that kind of speaks to you. So I would encourage everyone to lean into their intuition, using your emotions kind of as a barometer, to figure out exactly what works for you and implement that regularly. I think consistency is really key. Some of the examples from the literature are physical exercise. They always say the endorphin surge helps relax our mind. Taking walks, going to the gym, riding a bike, whatever it is that speaks to you is something that we want to engage with. Being in nature, allowing for our sensations to just be one with nature, um, allowing for the cold air to hit our skin, breathing deeply, enjoying the sounds of nature, sometimes creates a mindfulness exercise in and of itself. Meditation, most of the literature indicates that breath work is really efficacious. Doing things like yoga is also really efficacious. Engaging in your favorite hobby, as Dr. Edmonds mentioned, whatever that is for you, whether it's painting, listening to music, making music, poetry, whatever the case may be, engaging in that practice regularly is probably going to be really efficacious in coping. And not forgetting to engage socially. I know here and now things may feel really turbulent for some. Some may be really content with the situation, but continuing to have that conversation and engage with your peers and cohort is really important as well. Sleep, the evidence indicates that sleeping at least 7 hours is really helpful. So if that's something that helps you cope, by all means. And of course, limiting our screen time, our social media access, trying to reduce the amount of doom scrolling that we're engaging with, limiting even our news information could also be helpful as well. As we move towards the next slide, looking at tools and strategies for managing classroom discussions of controversial topics, along with if you are going to be engaging in controversial conversation, I think some of these would still apply. These are coming from our Senior Vice Provost for Academics, the Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning, and the Director of Faculty Affairs. Um, to begin, just underlying to our side potentially losing or winning, how are we choosing to process is a really important question. And I think if we look at kind of our way of engagement, there is kind of a tension between conflict and connection. That's the core of how we choose to process political anxiety. So I think it might be good to reframe and maybe entertain the question, are we processing the election mainly from a lens grounded in conflict mode? Or are we taking the opportunity of engagement to connect with others, to potentially do positive work and engage with our communities? So if we're reconsidering our approach, our first step to if we are going to engage in these conversations is recognition and acknowledgement of the moment. So before engagement, it might be helpful to acknowledge that the election is a significant event. Students, peers, faculty, staff may have strong emotions around it. And I think if we begin the process recognizing that the emotion, recognizing the moment, it'll show empathy, create space for all folks that are engaging in this conversation to process their feelings. So one could start the conversation with something like, I know this election is weighing on many of us. I want to acknowledge the significance of this time, to then create kind of the groundwork to have that open dialogue. The next step would be establishing community guidelines. So if you're going to be discussing the election in a classroom setting, or any setting for that matter, set clear expectations for how the class will engage in the discussion, emphasizing things like civility, respect, keeping an open mind approach to different viewpoints, reminding students that it's okay to disagree, or peers, faculty, staff for that matter, but it's essential to do so respectfully. And kind of revisiting what Dr. Edmonds mentioned with regards to the Augustinian way, accepting our differences is what makes us stronger. And the community guidelines could also include actively listening without interrupting, avoiding personal attacks or demeaning language, focusing on ideas rather than individuals, and agreeing to disagree without being disagreeable. We want to engage in these conversations to be able to foster critical thinking as well. So engaging folks, engaging in this conversation to critically engage with the election-related topics, potentially even through the lens of the course content, wherever it's applicable. Again, the goal is to enhance understanding and analytical skills rather than to promote particular political views, and always reconsidering multiple perspectives, using evidence to support arguments, reflecting on implications of the election outcomes in a way that's educational, and also ways that could be relevant to a specific major or field of study. Of course, being able to provide a nonpartisan fact-based approach would be important as well. So when discussing the election, avoid endorsing specific candidates or political positions, focusing in on how we can serve, helping folks understand the electoral process, the historical context, policy implication, maybe even resources that would serve to change. And we can use this as a means to inform students, faculty, staff with reliable, nonpartisan resources to guide their learning, help them cut through misinformation, and hopefully impact social change. Again, revisiting community guidelines, managing emotional responses. So emotionals are pretty high for most folks. So when having this type of conversation, understanding that it can become contentious. So if the conversation does veer off track or becomes too heated, being able to step in, de-escalate, remind all those that are engaged of the ground rules, letting students know that it's okay to step away from a conversation, especially if they're feeling uncomfortable or overwhelmed, and then tapping into resources that are available, such as, talking with their resident advisor, accessing a range of services offered by the counseling center, talking with family, friends, continuing the conversation with faculty in office hours, etc. We want to always encourage faculty, staff, anyone engaging in these conversations, to be honest, to focus on what is in their control. So encouraging folks to focus on actions that they can take, such as voting, participating in civic engagement, advocating for issues that they care about, reinforcing that even though we can't control election outcomes, we can control how we respond to them. And again, promoting well-being, self-care, reminding students of the importance of self-care, especially during times of heightened stress, encouraging them to take breaks from news, social media, engaging in practice of mindfulness, engaging in activities that bring balance to their lives and brings joy to their lives is also very important. And extending flexibility and compassion. I think this is a time where we all need to be leaning in towards each other, being flexible with each other, and that applies to our courses. So if you're in a position of authority where you can extend flexibility to deadlines or to workloads, if students are expressing a need for temporary adjustments due to stress or anxiety, being able to show that compassion can go a long way in supporting everyone around us. And lastly, on our next slide, I wanted to quote Dr. David Rosmarin, who's the author of Thriving with Anxiety. He's a Harvard psychologist who works at the Center for Anxiety. He said, "Let go and accept that the election is not in our control. And maybe that's a good thing. If we had control, it wouldn't be democratic." And maybe reframing our focus on what we can control, focusing on what is in our purview, and trying to forget about the rest. And there's, going along with that, there's a lot that we feel we may not understand fully, which means there's a lot we may need to focus in on listening and learning from. As Dr. Edmond mentioned, our feelings are really important. They serve as kind of a compass, letting us know where we need to go, maybe what we need to do, and maybe what we need to receive from those around us. So specifically, feeling hopeless may mean that there's a need to be with people that bring hope or engage with activities that bring us hope. Feeling helpless may mean that there's a need to find ways to find help, access help, receive help, maybe even give help. Feeling speechless may mean that there's a need to find people and places where we can have a voice that might be heard. And I think with all these turbulent times right now, it might feel like the best recourse is to retract and kind of armor up and build walls. Dr. Edmonds, you said it best. Maybe this is a time where instead of armoring up and building walls, we now build bridges. Angela Davis was quoted saying, "Walls turned sideways are bridges." And I think maybe we need to lean into that and maybe lean more into connection at this time, maybe even more now than ever. And with that said, focus on eating, resting, hydrating, finding joy, taking action where you can. Tap into groups, your community, your people. They need you as much as you may need them. And just remember, we're all in this together. I think we'll open the floor up for any questions that there may be.
I see one question in the chat, so feel free if you have other questions, feel free to add them in. It says, how would you navigate conversations with students who are managing the emotions that come from political differences between partners, friends, and family? The two things I thought of is I think it depends on what the objective is. So when I think of like my interpersonal effectiveness skills, I think about how do I build curiosity? So I think of the acronym GIVE, G-I-V-E. So G is be gentle. I is act interested. V is validate. And E is have an easy manner. So I think about if the relationship is really important, how can we be gentle? This goes back to like which part of you is driving the bus, right? So if we are kind of in fight mode, and maybe feeling like I can't believe you voted this way. I can't believe you believe this. Like that must mean you don't really care about me, right? That's not gentle. That's not interested in what the perspective might be of the other. I think sometimes we don't think about we live in a time in which there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and there's the algorithm. So it's not like when I was a kid, like if you wanted the news, you watched like one of the main like TV channels at like certain times a day, and that's how you got your news. But now it's like, what website are you on? What app are you in? What's the algorithm for social media that gets you this kind of content versus this kind of content? So who knows what's fact and what's misinformation? And so I think, what can you validate? Um, Maybe you can validate everything that the person is saying or thinking or feeling, but maybe there's some aspect you can, and then have an easy manner. So how are we, that doesn't mean dismiss your feelings, but how can we give a vibe that we actually want to be in dialogue? We want to be in conversation. Because building those bridges and staying in relationship over a long period of time might actually create change, transformation. And then I think of the skill fast when your self-respect is the most important thing. F is be fair. A is don't apologize. S is stick to your values. And T is be truthful. So sometimes we need to stand or sit in our own truth, but that doesn't mean we dismiss other people's truths and other people's values. How do we make room for both and see if there's a request? Maybe you ask a friend or family member to come to a workshop with you or an event, or listen to a podcast together, watch a movie together, and that might spark dialogue. And maybe you're willing to also do that thing that might be uncomfortable or seem like, you know, you don't think you're going to buy into it, but maybe there's a little bit of curiosity that comes in that. And I think that a person needs to check in with oneself to see what's my capacity? Can I actually hold space for a differing opinion that might agitate me, or that might move me into shutdown? And so maybe I need to proceed gently and take a break, or maybe for now, maybe not engage in those topics until you feel better resourced. I don't know, Cap, if you have other stuff you want to add.
No, I mean, I think that's beautifully said. I would agree with everything that you said. I think we're in a position where we can almost model behaviors that we kind of want to enact or see enacted as a sense of support. So creating a safe environment, showing empathy, showing compassion, giving grace, modeling that, hearing whatever conversation the student is coming in with. And then empowering them to be able to create that space to have a connective moment with whatever family member is voicing something that might be converse to what they believe, and trying to foster some sort of connective opportunity to hear each other. And I think whatever we can do to establish that kind of connective opportunity is something that we need to really like focus on.
Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah. And any other questions? Anybody wants to drop into the chat? Any final thoughts for you, Cap, on, as you think about wrapping up this webinar, and any final words you might want to say to people to support them in this tender time?
Um, just maybe reiterating what we've said is use your feelings as a barometer, really lean into what it is that you're feeling, create connective opportunities, and just to be engaged. I think it's really important here and now more than ever to just stay connected to whoever you can, um, and just create a sense of safety, security, or whatever it is that you're looking for with whoever you can.
Mm,
How about you?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think I guess something I'll add that I didn't mention earlier. I think this idea of humility and holding multiple truths is really important. I think, I don't know about you all, but for me, when people disagree with me and they come in hot and heavy and what I perceive as condescending, like, oh, that's really a turnoff for me. Though when people speak from the eye, like how things land for them, how they're thinking about things, how they feel. I soften and I'm more curious. And so I guess I would just encourage us to soften while still holding our feelings, and to think about like what might be missing from this conversation, what might be left out. Um, could there be other opinions out there that I might not even know about, other perspectives? And how do we leave room for democracy, right? That we all come to our own understanding and we all get to choose what our values are. And how do we respect this idea that power and privilege plays a role in this too, right? That some of us have identities that we're born into or that we pass as, that makes it a little safer to move around in the world. That makes us feel like we can take up more space, and others of us feel more vulnerable. That every election really builds a lot of anxiety and terror about our personal rights. And so, how do we hold each other tenderly while fighting for whatever we conceive as justice?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, great. Great to be in conversation with you, Cap, as always.
Me
I hope
too.
that people will metabolize and digest and try to integrate all of these skills that we've shared with you over the last 45 minutes or so, and wishing you all well as you wrap up this semester in 2024, moving into 2025. Take care, everyone.
Take care.